Welcome, everyone. In this program, we're going to be talking about an issue that has become rather challenging for hotels and restaurants around the country. How should your business handle anti-mask guests? Well, Andria Ryan and her team at Fisher & Phillips have created a 5-step action plan. So let's get started. We do need to let you know that this is not legal advice. It's education and information and some suggested practices. So please keep that in mind. My name is Stephen Barr, founder of HospitalityLawyer.com. Joining me today from the Fisher & Phillips law firm is Andria Ryan, partner at Fisher & Phillips, co-chair of the hospitality industry group, and also part of the COVID-19 team at Fisher & Phillips. And they have developed some outstanding resources that you will find available to you on our HospitalityLawyer.com Converge blog. Click on the blog. You'll see the article about the 5 steps. And if you go to the bottom of that article, you will see some outstanding resources that Andria and her team have put together for you. Checklists, resources, bringing you up to speed about how to reopen. So I hope you'll take advantage of that. So let's real quickly run through the 5 steps, and then we're going to come back with Andria and talk about each one more fully. Step number 1. Understand that you are permitted to require your employees and visitors to wear cloth face coverings or masks. Step number 2, be proactive with your mask policy. Step number 3, train your staff. Step number 4, reasonably accommodate visitors if they have a medical condition. And step 5, delicately deal with visitors who refuse to comply. So Andria, great article. We've gotten extraordinary feedback about the article that you and your team put together. But before we get into the steps, tell us a little bit about Fisher & Phillips.
Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate that. We too have gotten a lot of really fabulous feedback on a difficult situation and difficult time. Fisher & Phillips is a national labor and employment firm. We represent management only, and we have over 350 lawyers and 37 offices across the country. We practice in every state. And again, our focus is 100% on defending employers in labor and employment matters. We've developed a COVID-19 task force, which, as you said, has provided, we're there every step of the way, and we are trying to provide very practical advice, including moving forward. The mask issue has come up recently, so we hit that pretty hard. Next, we see the issues of vaccines coming along. So we're trying to stay on top of these are very unusual times for employers.
Yeah, they certainly are, and appreciate all the hard work that you guys are putting into this. I do want to plug one particular resource that you guys have developed that we have found exceptionally helpful are your FAQs, your frequently asked questions. They have been terrific from the get-go, so we hope you'll continue to produce those selfishly, but for everybody that's watching this, get to that blog. You can also locate those on the Fisher & Phillips website, and the links to those websites, to their resources directly, are at the bottom of the article that you can find them. Well, Andria, let's look, as I said in the beginning, we're hearing more and more anecdotally that, and we're seeing in the news that people are pushing back pretty hard about wearing masks. Now, we don't know how pervasive it is, but it is occurring. So let's get back to the steps and let's talk about it. And the first question right out of the box is, as a business owner, as a hotel, as an innkeeper, do I have the right to insist that my employees and my customers wear masks?
Yeah, the answer is very simple, and it's yes. Sometimes it's mandated by your state or local ordinance. Sometimes it's simply a policy where you're trying to be proactive about this very difficult virus situation. But we recommend that you as a public accommodation, number one, your employees. You know, it's an industry standard wearing masks. So that's really a given in the industry. But very commonly, it's very rare for me to go into any business that accommodates the public that doesn't require its visitors to wear masks. So simple answer is yes.
And that's good to know. So even if my government that I'm subject to does not have a mandate, as the business, I can still require masks.
You can. And now remember, if your government does mandate it, you risk fines and citations for not complying.
Yeah.
So a different level of enforcement. And a little sometimes easier to enforce with your visitors when you've got that local ordinance or state ordinance to point to.
Yeah, very good point. And just to wrap that step up, and ladies and gentlemen, is that we all have a duty to operate with reasonable care. And so even if there isn't a government mandated, as Andrea pointed out, it's kind of the standard now. And you need to implement this policy. Many of you are involved with brands that have established that as a brand standard now. So you need to comply with that. OSHA is suggesting it, WHO has suggested it, right? CDC. So lots of reasons to implement this policy. Because Andrea, I think we talked not too long ago that we're seeing some litigation, not necessarily from our customers, but from our employees that have died related to COVID or been sick, and perhaps we haven't handled it well, or they're opting out of comp because of wrongful death, and we're getting sued for that, and then it becomes negligence claim. So reasonable care really becomes an issue. Is that a fair way to look at it?
It does. Every protocol, every safety protocol you put in place is one meant to protect people, your employees and your guests. But secondarily, if you're challenged, if a tragedy occurs, you need to be in a position to demonstrate that you put industry recommended standards in place and enforce them. And Stephen, what we're seeing, these anecdotal situations, is the enforcement issue. When hoteliers, when airlines, when folks are trying to enforce these mask policies, that's when we're having the trouble.
That's the issue. And we're going to get to that on step 3 and step 5. But before we get there, you make the point in your article that we need to be proactive with our mask policy. Tell us what you mean about that, because when I read it, I found it to be a very important component.
You know, Stephen, you'd think that most of us, most of us that are living and breathing in this new normal are we've got the mask, we're expecting it, it's in our purses, it's in our pockets, we're ready, right. We're ready to wear it where we're required. But don't count on that. And we strongly recommend that in every possible manner that you put your policy in front of your guests at the time they make the reservation, on your website, on social media, on apps, on any text messages that you send. Your guests shouldn't be surprised that you're going to ask them this of them when they arrive at your property.
Yeah, and we practice social distancing, right? We're setting the stage and the expectations of what our guests should expect.
That's right. And I've seen some very interesting and clever ways that people are putting forth their mask policy. I mean, you don't have to just simply say, we will require you to wear a mask when you come to our property. And a lot of folks are saying, we're requiring our guests to wear a mask. We appreciate your use. We're looking out for your safety. Yeah. We're wearing masks for your safety. Please, we expect you to wear one for ours. There's some less militant messages about masks.
That's a great way to put it. The diplomacy is going to be important throughout this situation. So that's very helpful. Okay, and I love the fact that in your article, you talk about to put it out in a diverse distribution method, right? Not just the email, or pre-reservation, post-reservation, confirmation, reminder about the reservation, but also all your social platforms. I think that's great, because we just don't want them to be surprised. And we found that if you'll do that, it will really mitigate these belligerent circumstances. So I hope you'll follow that step for sure. So Andrea, let's roll into step 3 though. And I think the last time you and I spoke, you made the comment that you felt like this was important, if not the most important step in the 5 steps. So talk to us about the training component and why you think this is so significant.
Yeah, I do, Stephen. I think this is really the most important step, because this is where the rubber meets the road. Your guest arrives and they are unhappy, or they're belligerent, or they don't want to, or they're passive aggressively non-compliant, whatever it is. Who is it that's going to greet them and try to coax them into complying with your policy?
Yeah.
It's going to be your frontline staff, usually not management staff. And your folks, your bell staff, your valet parking, your front desk agents, we don't train them. We normally, in the past, have never trained them to handle this kind of situation, to learn to de-escalate a situation with a guest. We train them to be courteous, to be friendly, to try to resolve problems. But this is a unique problem. And so I think it's important to look at your training in two different ways. You need to do two different steps. You need to train your frontline staff on what you want them to say to your guests. How are you going to approach a guest that is walking or attempting to walk in the front door without a mask? What script do you want to give your employees to use? And then secondarily, when should they escalate a situation to a management level employee? I think it's important that your management level, a designated 1 or 2 or 3 management level employees, know what the law says, know what your policy says and requires, and is prepared to have that confrontation, for lack of a better discussion, with your guest if they're non-compliant, not your frontline employees.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I want to break down a little of this for the audience. First of all, de-escalation, I think, is the key word, right? That's ultimately what we're not training people about. We need to train people about this. Second is, I'm going to use this term because you did, and I think it's important that we distinguish, but we're talking about de-escalating the conflict and the situation, but it's important that your staff know to escalate the circumstances up to somebody that has been fully trained to deal with somebody that just is not willing to be reasonable or to listen or to comply. Now, in that regard, Andrea, talking about mitigating some of these things before they even happen, how important is it for the manager, general manager, and employees to set the example for other employees as well as guests?
Absolutely. Great point, Stephen. If your employees, or you're permitting your employees, because you have to look at it that way, you're permitting your employees to wear their masks under their chin, to keep their noses outside their mask, to let the mask hang down, to not wear it when they're supposed to, a guest is going to see that at some point. And unfortunately, it might be that particularly belligerent guest that doesn't want to wear a mask. So it is critically important that you enforce that policy like you do every other safety protocol you have in the hotel.
Yeah, that's a great point. Let's just be clear. This is not an effective way to wear a mask. This is not an effective way to wear a mask, right?
That's right.
The mask does this. And it doesn't have to be a mask. It can be a face covering, right? Although we have learned, Andrea, that the gaiters are not very effective because they're too thin. So the other types of face coverings or the mask are preferred. And then I think that's important. And another thing I think we talked about previously is I'm the owner and the manager, and I want to stipulate what type of mask my employees wear. And your thought, I think, was then you better be prepared to provide the mask. Is
correct? Correct. If you're going to mandate what type of face covering, which is appropriate, then you need to be prepared to provide it. In fact, consider providing it to the guest. Have some spare, a box of surgical masks at the desk, at the front desk, at the valet stand, wherever it may be, and maybe that's a talking point for your employees. Can I offer, Mr. Smith, can I offer you a mask? I see you don't have one and we have a mask policy.
Yeah, so
maybe the best.
Exactly. Just to recap, so training is crucial. Setting the example as the manager or owner for all of your employees, wearing the mask properly, socially distancing, washing your hands. Those are all significant examples that you need to set each and every day, right? The training needs to be around de-escalation. Providing a script can be very helpful. right? Knowing when to get that fully trained person involved in the conversation, right? And then I'm going to suggest from a training perspective that you role play, that you have one employee be the belligerent guest and the other employee learning to stay calm and to continue to kind of script, use your talking points very delicately. And we'll talk more about this in step 5, but I just wanted to bring that up when we're talking about training. Well, okay, then that's the first 3. Let's go to number 4 because this is important as well. Excuse me. This is important as well, that we have some exceptions. Most of the laws have carved out some exceptions for people under a certain age, but then we also have some health exceptions that the ADA, I assume, promulgates. Can you talk a little bit about those so that we don't run afoul of that when we're enforcing this?
Right. As difficult as all of this is to enforce, we need to worry about these exceptions as well. As a public accommodation, your hotel has obligations under the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's the same law that requires you to allow service animals, for example. We make your facilities accessible to have lifts at your pool. And one of those is if a guest has a particular medical condition, maybe a respiratory condition, that does not permit them to wear a mask. And you must determine whether you can accommodate them by making some exception or modification to your policy to allow them to come and stay at your hotel, even if they can't wear a mask. Now, it's important that we know what our ordinances say. So if our ordinances say no exceptions, or our ordinances say what kind of exceptions are acceptable, let's know what they say, although the federal law generally, takes precedent over preempt state and local laws. But then we come to the question of what could we accommodate? First, I want to say, Stephen, there shouldn't be no confrontation over this. Most visitors, most guests do not carry their medical information in their back pocket. They don't have it in their purse, and they're not prepared to show it to a front desk agent at a hotel. So if an individual walks in and says, I cannot wear a mask, you politely ask them, and I cannot wear a mask, I have a medical condition, my best advice to you is accept their word and move on to the next step, which is there something we can do to accommodate this situation?
Yeah, I think that's important. And that's the key, right? When they say, I'm sorry, I have this condition, it doesn't mean they get to come in without the mask. It triggers the conversation around what's a reasonable accommodation. And so a suggestion I think I've heard you make previously is, well, we have a face shield at the desk. It's sanitized. Can we ask you to wear this during your stay? Would that be an example of an accommodation?
Yes. Now, especially in a jurisdiction that requires a face shield. So if it's just your policy, you could, as an alternative to the face shield, which is one good alternative, is to say, or let's say the guest can't wear the face shield for whatever medical reason. Then we have a discussion about how we can limit their access to public areas. Mr. Smith, will you agree that you will stay in your room, you won't visit the restaurant if it's open, or the pool area if it's open, or you won't linger in the lobby area? Can we agree during your brief stay that you will do what you can to minimize your contact with the public? And maybe have that individual sign a short acknowledgement that I understand this is what I'm going to do while I'm visiting your property.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it could also be something they may feel like, well, the mask is restrictive, but perhaps a different type of face covering might work. You mentioned the shield, a scarf, something else that might at least provide some modicum of mitigation, but perhaps not as great as the actual mask that gives them the trouble. So remember, ladies and gentlemen, just because they say I can't wear the mask doesn't give them a free pass into your facility. And the reason for that is your responsibility is not just to this guest, but it's to all of your employees and all of your guests. And that's why we're using the masks in the first place, and to keep everybody safe. So keep that in mind. Well, Andrea, that's very helpful. Let's get back on to step number 5, and that is delicately deal with visitors who refuse to comply. Easier said than done, I know, but it gets back to what we talked about in the training: de-escalation, have somebody else done, but give us some tips that you're thinking about that we can utilize to make this happen.
Yeah, Stephen, I've read a couple of articles recently that surprised me, and they referred to folks as enforcers. Who are your designated enforcers for this policy? And
yeah,
when are we going to call law enforcement?
yeah,
And all of that made me cringe a little bit
yeah,
and say, yes, maybe we have to call law enforcement, but that was their step 5. That would be my step 10 or maybe 20.
yeah,
So I think it's important. I think the first question is, if this is a policy, not an ordinance, state or local, are you going to permit guests to violate your policy? Are you going to allow, if the guest says, I adamantly refuse, I have a medical condition, I can't wear the mask, I can't wear the shield, I'll do what I can to socially distance, but I'm coming in. I want to come in. Is your answer going to be yes, or is your answer going to be no? You need to tell your management team or your designated managers when the rubber meets the road, what's the answer for them. So we coax, we try to convince. I think once you're past coaxing, a manager's involved.
yeah,
So if your frontline staff can't coax a guest to be compliant, then we're moved on to convince. And I think that's time for a manager to get involved.
yeah,
And to bring a guest to a private location, to have a discussion, to show them the policy, to show them the website, to show them the reservation form that they received,
yeah.
and potentially the ordinance. Somebody needs to be a bit of an expert on that ordinance, and try to convince your guest to comply.
Yeah, and just as you mentioned, gently remind them, hey, now remember, we shared this with you up front, and for the sake of everybody involved, this is what we require. And I'm sorry, we just can't make an exception due to the public health issue here. And if somebody pushes back against that kind of reasonableness and continues to refuse to comply, then I think we've done all we can do, because you make the point in the article, we're not going to raise our voice. We're never going to touch the guest, right? We're going to continue in a very calm manner, just reinforcing what we've, reiterating is a better word, of what we've talked about and how we shared the information up front. And look, especially if you're in a mandated situation, this isn't us. This is the requirement that we've been, as a business, that we have to follow along with, or our brand says we have to do it. So please, for everybody's sake, if you can comply with this, we'd really appreciate it. Yeah, I think that's really good guidance about that. I do want to make the point, Andrea, that, guests in hotels, they are there, or a restaurant, they're there for a lawful purpose. And a lawful purpose means not just complying with the law, but also with our house rules that we have, like no shoes, no shirt, no service, etc. We have the right to refuse service to guests that refuse to comply with legal, non-illegal, discriminatory house rules that are there in place for everybody's safety and security. So once they step across that or fail to comply or make it known that they're not going to comply, then really they fall into that trespasser category, and we would treat them again as step 20 in your book, but we would treat them then that perhaps we do need to get some assistance from law enforcement. And Andrea, if I may, I want to take just a moment. Look, law enforcement personnel have challenging jobs, and they're difficult, and we want to support them every step of the way to the extent we can. But I do want to make this point with some of you that are hiring ex-law enforcement personnel to be your security at your hotels. We've had some situations recently where ex-law enforcement personnel acting as security in hotels or restaurants have kind of been more, as Andrea pointed out, enforcers rather than supportive and coaxing and convincing. And I just think that it's very important that we recognize that people need a broader toolbox than just a hammer, because if they only have a hammer, every situation they come up against tends to look like a nail. So in your training, be thinking about empathy, be thinking about de-escalation, be thinking about role-playing and re-scripting, and not being the enforcer, as Andrea pointed out, but by being the coaxer and the person to encourage them to comply.
You know, Stephen, we talked about the medical situation, which is delicate because people sometimes don't want to be forthcoming about their medical condition or things like that. So, and as good hospitality folks, we'll handle that delicately. But what about the individual who's just an anti-masker that just says, I have a political, I have just a general objection to it, and they're out there, and you're welcoming every guest that comes through the door as long as they play by your rules. And so it is not the time or place to argue whether they're right or they're wrong. Your employees need to understand it doesn't matter if they agree or disagree with that individual. It's really a matter of enforcing a policy. And I've had a lot of, folks say, well, what do I say to them? And you say, I simply respect your opinion, but we have decided as an organization to be better safe than sorry. And we'll probably know more about this virus in many years to come. But this is our policy today, and we hope you will comply with it.
We can't have a better ending than that, Andrea. Thank you very much. That is sage guidance. Thank you so much for all of your time, for all the work that your team has been doing in this space. We are all better for it. So thank you for that. And selfishly, we hope it continues.
Thank you. It will. It will.
That's good news.